As we all know, open source runs the world's infrastructure. Modern economy runs on open source. But according to Chainguard, there is a silent risk most CIOs are not tracking closely enough. They argue that when maintainers step away from mature projects, companies are left with production dependencies that have no one answering security tickets. And most organizations don't even know how to audit this exposure. The SLAs they are signing have vague language about limited life support that doesn't translate to real liability protection. So, is this actually a widespread problem? And if so, how do you quantify and manage it? That's exactly what we are going to find out in this episode of Secure by Design with Dan Lorenc, CEO and co-founder at Chainguard. Dan, you folks just launched EmeritOSS. Talk about the specific problem you are solving here. What does maintainer abandonment actually look like in production environments?
Yeah, you made a comment. You said we all know how open source works. I don't know how open source works. It's this magical phenomenon that like you can't explain why it works. It's people writing code in their spare time, doing it for random reasons. It's a chaotic system. Like there's no economic explanation for any of this. It's not like a normal motivation. People do this for all sorts of reasons, and they do it, and it for some reason it works. That's kind of the mystery of all of this. All modern computing, your cell phone, your computer, your laptop, the ATM machine, the fast food place you go to, that's all built on open source, which is software that's been built by strangers on the internet for whatever reason they feel like it. And like you mentioned, every once in a while, their motivations change. People don't want to keep maintaining software for free on the internet forever. And companies have no right to demand that they keep doing that either, because they're under no contract. This software is put on the internet for free. And a lot of projects eventually go unmaintained. They go end of life, and the maintainers say, I'm hanging up my hat. I'm not going to do this anymore. That's a big problem, because companies that depend on that software then have to figure out what to do. They have to figure out where it's running. They have to find replacements, and they have to do it all on whatever timeline has been set by these projects when they decide to archive themselves or go end of life. This isn't a new problem. Open source has been around for 30 years, right? 30 plus years. We all know that. But a lot of regulatory agencies and pressures and frameworks and governments have now started to kind of crack down on this whole concept of running end-of-life software. And this isn't unique to open source either, right? I hope you're not still running Windows XP on your machine at home. But there's proprietary software that goes end of life too, and vendors only backport patches for so long. And so the problem here is that unpredictable nature and the volume of open source that enterprises are using. At any given day, something is going out of maintenance, something is going end of life. And it's really hard to build predictable product roadmaps and keep your teams focused when they're constantly having to swap out these components that are getting deprecated or archived in the background. And so that's the gap that we're trying to solve here with EmeritOSS. Make it easier for enterprises to rely on this software by offering to take over the maintenance of those projects after those maintainers are done. And we're not doing this forever. We're just kind of expanding the lifetime of these projects so that folks, they know they have to migrate off someday, but they can do it on their own schedules rather than doing it as soon as one of these bulletins gets posted.
Let's talk about the regulatory side. The Cyber Resiliency Act, or CRA, in Europe puts real pressure on this. Companies can be fined, and it's not just European companies, it's anyone serving EU customers. How serious is that regulatory threat?
Yeah, the CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe, is a big one that's casting a lot of light on the usage of open source. And you mentioned a lot of confusion earlier. And yeah, some of the first drafts of the CRA, we're actually going to place the burden of maintaining the software again on the open source maintainers who do it for free. The complete wrong way to look at this problem. And they've shifted it around now. And there's this notion of an open source steward that certain foundations can kind of take on that burden. But the right place to place that burden is on the people using the open source. Any of these licenses say the software comes with no liabilities or warranties, use at your own risk, that kind of thing. And every time you grab one of these, you are using it at your own risk. It means you have to accept that risk and have a plan to maintain it, have a plan to get patches for it if you need it, have a plan to move off of it eventually if it does become deprecated. And those are plans people should have had all along. In reality, right? The problem here is not with open source. The problem is with the way companies track and manage and maintain it themselves internally. We saw this with Log4j if you go way back. That vulnerability in Log4j was worst case scenario. But the maintainers patched it over a weekend, right? How many proprietary software vendors get patches out that fast over a weekend when something like that happens? 90 days is typical industry standard best practice for how long after a vulnerability has been reported. But organizations, the stats were like something like 40% of organizations had redeployed vulnerable versions of Log4j that next year. The problem isn't with the open source, it's with the way it's used. But it is a problem, and that's the problem that we're trying to solve here and help people in the way that they're building on open source.
Let's talk about from the perspective of CIOs. How should they be auditing their dependency? Because they don't even know where all those pieces are. It's like assembly line of an automobile, so that they're also aware of those risk exposure. Because most companies, they have hundreds or thousands of dependencies. Where do they even start? It's not an easy problem to solve.
No, it's not. And it's because of the free nature of open source. And it's a pretty new problem, right? If you go back 10 or 15 years, people were scared to run open source because of the legal threats. And if you look up FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that term, and you go to Wikipedia, the textbook definition of FUD was the campaign Microsoft ran about Linux in the 90s, trying to scare everyone away, saying, if you use this, you're going to get sued. And that worked for a while. So it took a long time before lawyers and compliance teams and OSPOs, open source program offices inside of the world's largest and most regulated enterprises finally got comfortable running open source. But as soon as they got comfortable with it, it spread everywhere because it's free. Right? I know exactly how many seats of every SaaS tool we're using in our company because we have to pay for them and track them. But when something becomes free, you stop monitoring it that way. And that's kind of the effect now that you do have to start monitoring it. It's chasing down on all of these free things that nobody has even put into a spreadsheet anymore.
Let's talk about SLA gap quickly. What does limited life support actually mean in legal terms, and where does liability sit when a dependency gets unpatched?
Yeah, I think liability is a big hammer here that is forcing a lot of conversations that needed to be had forever ago. There's a software supply chain. There's also a liability supply chain. And liability does not terminate on the open source maintainers, right? Just because they publish that source code, they're not liable for any of it. They gave it to you. Liability is on the person that took that, put it as a component in one of their systems and deployed it and sold that to their customers. That's a lot of liability because everyone is using that same open source now. And if there's a bug in a critical component, everyone is hit. Up until recently, everyone just kind of pretended that didn't exist and said, well, if we're hacked, everyone else is hacked, or we're only responsible for the code we wrote. And that's the wrong way to look at this. The right way to look at it is you're responsible for all the code you used, whether you wrote it or not, which is kind of causing this wake-up moment for the whole industry.
Can you talk about how does EmeritOSS actually work from technical point of view? Are you forking projects? Are you providing patches or something else altogether? Walk me through the mechanics.
So the way it works today, we forked a couple of projects that were archived by their maintainers. They had already decided to archive them, and we came in after and forked them and moved them to our organization. And we've set up a ton of automation to do this already, right? So we're just kind of scaling that automation to these projects. And these are projects that kind of fit in a gray area, right? Where they got marked as end of life, but they weren't really having much work done on them before that to begin with. They were done. And that's kind of a fine thing. And that's good for the industry to accept. So we're not committing to do feature work. We're not committing to add support for new things. We're really just going to be there in case there's a vulnerability and we have to get it patched and hand that to everyone using it. And that's kind of that gap that we're filling. We'd like to be able to work with maintainers and move earlier in this process. If a maintainer is thinking about archiving a project, we would love to come in and do it right there with them and help, congratulate them for putting that project into the world and getting it so adopted. But this is an early program, and we're trying to see how far we can scale it.
Is it possible to talk a bit about that technical side of it?
Yeah, it's just a lot of automation, right? And we do this today across all of our core products too. We're maintaining somewhere around 100,000 different projects where we have automation internally to bump them and patch them and rebuild them anytime there's a vulnerability. So we're really just taking on a few more of those. And a lot of these were already core to a lot of the other projects or dependencies that we were shipping. So we're continuing to keep the source code available. Our automation is continuing to build it, and we ship those built versions to our customers.
Now let's talk about who owns this problem inside an enterprise. Is this a CISO issue, a CTO infrastructure issue, or does it sit with developers and product teams?
Yeah, it's mostly targeting, there's a couple ways to think about that, right? The biggest end user is really the developers that get to keep working on and get to keep shipping their product roadmaps instead of having to drop everything they're working on right now and move off of one of these projects. I was talking to some folks about a large financial services institution, and one project that had been end of life caused hundreds of teams to have to change their roadmaps to figure out a path off of this. And they know they have to get off of it someday. But inside of an enterprise with 6-9 month release cycles and planning and annual targets and all of that, they have methods to do this. They have methods to plan for these migrations and plan for all of these big upgrades. What's disruptive, though, is when you have all of these ships already in flight and all of these dependencies and projects that need to be done in the right order. And then all of a sudden that whole roadmap gets tossed in the air and you have to refigure out how to do everything after you migrate off of one version of a project to another one.
Let's talk about the business side. What is the business case here? How do you quantify the cost of dependency risk versus the cost of a solution like EmeritOSS?
Yeah, the cost of the dependency risk is large, right? And a lot of these frameworks, like you talked about, the CRA, or in the US, the Secure Software Development Framework from NIST. These are kind of efforts to codify, what I like to say, they're codifying what like malpractice looks like in software, right? In medicine, if a doctor makes an honest mistake, that happens. If the doctor shows up to work drunk and forgets a scalpel inside of someone, there's, suturing up. That's very different. That's malpractice. We haven't had that concept in software. A standard set of best practices where if you do these things, you're following the industry best practices. And if you get breached after you're following industry best practices, that's one thing too. It's still bad. You've lost people's data. But it's very bad if you got breached for not following industry best practices. If you're on the latest version of all of your software and some nation state finds a 0-day and breaches you, you tried hard. It still sucks. You're going to have a rough weekend, but you did your best. But if you got breached because you're running on a 17-year-old version of some Java framework and forgot to update it, that's very different. And these new liability frameworks, you used that term liability earlier, are starting to make it so that the damages are a lot higher if that's the reason for a breach.
You mentioned automation. How much generative AI are you leveraging to maintain these projects at a scale?
That's part of this experiment too, right? We've adopted somewhere around a dozen projects into EmeritOSS so far. And it's not zero work from people, right? We do have a small team doing this. But part of this experiment is to see how many projects that small team can maintain over time and improve the automation in the ways that they work. Generative AI and Claude Code and all of these tools they're real and they're making developers a lot more efficient than they were before. And so I think we're going to be able to push this pretty far. My guess is that team of 3 people, if we keep improving the automation, should be able to do hundreds, maybe even 1,000 projects. It's also a perfect place for it because the work is very batchy. Vulnerabilities come into these projects, but usually not all on the same day. And so the more of these projects, the more economies of scale you get to.
Looking ahead, did you see this will become a standard part of enterprise open source strategy, or is this still an early adoption conversation?
I think, we kind of have to, right? There's no going back at this point. Enterprises, they have to have a plan for all of the open source that they're using. You have to have a plan to replace it. You have to have a plan to get patches for it if you need to. You can't kind of put that cat back in the bag where we are today. We like to say open source is free as in it's free as in puppy, not free as in beer, right? Puppies are cute, they're great, and if you walk by a box of them on the sidewalk with a sign that says free puppies, you might smile at them, but you're going to think through hard through who's going to take the puppy out every day to go to the bathroom, who's going to take care of it, who's going to pick up the poop, who's going to get the food and the water. And that's the same as open source. It is free. It's free to use, but you have to take care of it the same way you have to take care of any software. So it's a trade-off in where the costs come from.
This isn't a problem Chainguard can solve alone. What is the role of partnerships and the broader ecosystem here?
Open source is not a problem anyone can solve alone, right? It's thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all contributing to projects in different ways for different reasons. We depend on all of the projects that we use to build all of this open source. We depend on tons of them ourselves too. It is an ecosystem problem, which is hard because it's not a software problem. It's not a problem you can solve just through technology. And so, it's something the whole world is kind of going to have to grapple with together because we're all in this supply chain together.
Dan, Thank you so much for joining me and breaking down how enterprises should think about open source dependency risk and what EmeritOSS brings to the table. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And for those who are watching, if you are running your infrastructure with open source dependencies and you're not sure how to audit that exposure, make sure to check out Chainguard and EmeritOSS. And don't forget to subscribe to TFR, like this video, and share it with your team. Thanks for watching.